Hello, I'm Stuart Bowes, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course, people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen, and enjoy. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. And you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this, Energy Live News and futurenetzero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. Carbon capture and storage. Now, I'm actually a big fan of carbon capture, CCS, CCUS, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of people aren't. A lot of people hate it. A lot of people think it's a license to pollute. It's been around for quite a while, and we did a story about it, must be 10 years ago, where I sent a team to, I think it was Norway, to a big kind of research facility, they're looking at it. If you look at what's happened over the last 5 years, I suppose, there was a period before that, I think maybe a bit before that, where it was going to be the next big thing. The government said, we're going to back it. This was the government in the days of Cameron and the coalition. And then it all went quiet. People pushed ahead with renewable energies. And then obviously we've had another flip over the last few years with the carbon sort of problems with the gas prices and also security of supply. And now you have the Orange Master in charge. And Trumpy has said he's going to drill, baby, drill. Now, if he's going to drill, I don't think he's that stupid. He's not going to use carbon capture. So where is this technology? Recently, the UK government, Labour, have said it's a real fundamental part of our path to net zero. And they've invested some public money in developing a couple of clusters. But what is the science? Will it work? And do we really need it? That's what I'm going to discuss today on the Net Hero podcast. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Olivia Powis, who is the boss, the CEO of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, CCSA. Is that right, Olivia?
CCSA, yes.
That's lovely. So let's start an idiot's guide, and you're speaking to a good one here. What is carbon capture?
Carbon capture is, to first of all set out, this is not a new technology. This is a technology that has been around for many, many decades. And in Norway, they've been successfully capturing and storing CO2 for over 25 years. So I think that's important to sort of set out from the outset. But this is a technology that enables us to capture the CO2 emissions from heavy industries and from power stations, from gas power stations, for example, and then compress it and then transport that CO2 by pipeline or by ship and potentially road and rail as well to CO2 stores, which are offshore in geological formations deep below the seabed. So we're talking sort of 2 kilometers below the seabed. And there it's stored in rocks there. So either empty oil fields, old oil fields or saline formation, and essentially injected into the rock there. Then those rocks act like a sponge and they absorb that CO2. And then it's trapped there permanently by a layer trapping mechanisms, sort of like impermeable cap rock, which ensures that the CO2 stays down there. And then to really make sure it stays down there, then the CO2 is monitored. And there are, as soon as CO2 is injected into a store, then the monitoring and verification takes place to ensure that it remains down there. So it's...
Yeah, thank you for that. But let's just go back a stage, which is the thing I'm always confused about. So let's just go real old school. There's a coal power station, right? And there's plenty of them around the world. And it's burning coal. So it's got the furnace, it's burning it, turns the turbines. People kind of understand that. How do you capture? Is it the CO2 that would come out? People have seen the image of the big towers and the CO2. Is there something that sucks it out before that? How do you actually capture it, and at what stage of any process, whether it be gas, coal, doesn't matter what it is, an industrial process, how do you capture the CO2?
There are different ways, but the most common way is post-combustion capture, and captured from the flue gas. And they use a technique called a scrubbing technique, which is using solvents to
Yes.
separate out the CO2. And essentially, that's, in simple terms, that's the most common form
So it's
of
dissolved in this
capture
liquid,
technology.
basically.
Yep.
Okay, so
And
you
then,
you burn it, you burn whatever the source is, and as that gas escapes, before it escapes, that's where it's absorbed
yes,
into a liquid.
and the important bit is before it escapes. So yes,
Yeah,
it's then absorbed and then separated out and then compressed into a liquid type state
yeah.
and piped in that state and then injected under the seabed.
You said this technology is pretty old. It's been around a long time. So here's sort of like 60 seconds of quick questions. Right. Number one, does it work? How effective is it?
Yes, it works, and as I said, it's been used for many years, and Norway has got successful stores that have been successfully capturing and storing CO2 for over 25 years. So, this is important. It does work. We're
Because a lot
looking
of
at
people say it's unproven technology. You know that
yeah,
criticism.
and it's not. I think, and I've just been discussing this morning actually, but this is the new part of what we're looking at now is doing this at scale in the UK. This
Right.
is not, but there are already large projects in operation. There are over 50 projects in operation globally. So this isn't new. But I think the scale at which we need to roll it out now is the new
Is the new thing.
challenge, really.
What sort of efficiency do you get? So if you said there's 100% of carbon dioxide in the flue gas, how much can you get out? I assume you can't get all of it.
The government and we've been working with industry and government over the last 3 to 4 years to develop business models to effectively mechanisms to enable us to do that and to create the revenue mechanism from that. And those are stipulating we're looking at 90 to 95% capture rate. So it's
Wow.
high.
Wow,
It
it
is
is
high.
high. That's a lot higher
And
than I thought.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And it is, and those projects in Norway have been looking at those sorts of amounts of capture rate. So
That's pretty efficient then, yeah. Next quick question. The solvent that you use, again a criticism, you're putting some toxic stuff out there. Won't it leach into the rocks, and the actual solvent, the CO2 is kind of mixed into, that's bad for the environment. What's your answer to that one?
this is a highly regulated industry. So this is really, the Environment Agency are involved. We engage with DEFRA. These are not, I guess, to sort of put it in simple terms,
Yeah,
this is no different to the chemicals industry,
gotcha.
pharmaceuticals. We're looking at using these chemicals, and so it is incredibly important that we monitor this properly and use them. But all those regulatory frameworks are in place to make sure that that happens. And so the Environment Agency is industries working with the Environment Agency very careful to make sure that we are looking at safe levels of using these solvents and looking at the overall impact of doing that and how the CO2 is stored in permanently, so in perpetuity. But having a very strong regulatory function is what makes the UK also attractive. That we need to make sure
Yeah,
that
I get it.
everything is safe and sound.
I mean, look, as I said, I think it's a good technology. I think it's a vital part of net zero. But groups like Greenpeace and lots of other groups are very much against it. They think the costs are prohibitive, and that's always been the thing. I remember the government, I think it was Osborne, put in £1 billion. I never thought it actually went anywhere. I can't remember what happened to that, but this is another thing that people have said, okay, we get it, Olivia, you're saying the science works, but it's just prohibitively costly. There's a similar argument that's been with fusion. Again, how do you answer critics on that about the actual cost of building these plants?
Yeah, I mean, it's we have attempted to deploy CCUS before,
Yeah.
and like you say, Osborne cut that, and that was due to cuts right across
Yes.
spending
Yeah.
at the time. That was
Yeah.
austerity measures. I think the important thing to note is that this is an essential industry. So the Climate Change Committee published their seventh carbon budget
Yes.
last week,
Yeah.
and that noted again that we cannot get to net zero without CCUS. And so this is something that we've got to do. And when we consider industries like cement, energy from waste, these industries only have the only way they can decarbonize is through CCUS. So it's essential, and it's also essential in terms of chemicals, fuels. There are, if we're going to get to net zero, we've got
Yeah.
to decarbonize now, and so that's the key point. And if we can't afford to wait until we have alternatives to all these products that are low carbon. We've got to act now, and I think this is the point. When we're talking with critics and so those that are saying we mustn't do this. This is
Yes.
the license to continue. I think the message here is this isn't instead of any of the other low carbon technologies. This isn't instead of offshore wind. This isn't instead of other renewables.
Yeah. Yeah.
It works alongside them. And when you look at the Climate Change Committee, they've really the pathways that they've set out. We have to deploy all of these if we're going to get to net zero, and particularly towards the where we should be meeting the target by 2050. We're looking at greenhouse gas removals. So these are the engineered removals that are going to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So some of the CCUS is about decarbonising plants and making
Yes.
sure that the cement we
Yep.
make is low carbon cement. Others are about making sure that we have a negative CO2 impact. So we remove it, which is incredibly essential for those hard to abate, we call them hard to abate sectors, but aviation, etc., that aren't going to get to net zero on their own. So I think this is a transition, but we've got to act now. And perhaps if we'd acted 10 years ago, we'd be in a very different place
We
to where
might be.
we are
Yeah.
now. But we still need cement. We need to build hospitals,
Of
schools,
course. Of
all
course.
of it. And so to get there, we need to decarbonise them now.
I mean, look, like I said, I think it has to be part of it. But I suppose the other thing is, maybe our viewers and listeners have heard of things like, well, how does it work or whatever? And you mentioned one way, but there's this other thing called, I think it's called DAC, direct air capture, where you sort of suck it out. And again, this is something we covered a couple of years ago on the podcast. It just sounded like science fiction to me. Does that work? Is that something that can be used as well to kind of limit the processes of industry?
Yeah, and and the Climate Change Committee referred to this in their report last week that the critical role that DAC will play in terms of removing CO2 overall from the atmosphere. It's obviously a newer technology than retrofitting CCUS onto some of these industries, but there are projects that are being developed. And out there at the moment, and pilot projects that are working. So this is, it's not science fiction. This is
Well,
this is
I mean, idiot's guide, I don't expect you to be an engineer, but how does that thing work? Is it just like something just absorbs it out the air then?
Yes, it's essential. I mean, I guess in a sort of very simple way, it's almost like fans that are capturing it from the atmosphere, but the same, and then separating out the CO2 and then storing it. So from a point of view of kind of where you can put, it's much more mobile. It doesn't
Gotcha.
really matter where you put this.
And is
As
it
long
smaller, I assume, then?
they're still quite big structures, but they need to be. They don't have to be located next to where the industry is, but
Gotcha.
they should be located next to where the store is. So that's an opportunity that they can be located next to these geological stores, and they've got the freedom to be wherever. And to be honest, it doesn't matter where it is. CO2 out of the atmosphere is CO2 out of the atmosphere. So
True.
whether it's in this country or whether it's in another, we obviously want to develop the technology here so
Yeah,
that
the air doesn't just stay above the UK. Yeah.
exactly. But we've got our own targets and we've got to get to net zero. So we're going to use everything we can to get there.
You've definitely outlined in your own organisation. You put out a story that was on AGL Lab News, talking about you've got to make it more cost effective, right? And you talked about three things. So I just want to go through those. You talked about smarter funding, carbon markets, and public finance. Let's take each in turn. What do you mean by smarter funding allocation? Are you saying only back certain technologies that definitely work, or where's it been wasted? Because if you're saying smarter, it's been dumber in the past, then clearly.
I think this is around making sure that 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 there are allocation programs. So I think perhaps look at offshore wind and the way that it's been able to deploy as an industry.
Yeah,
There have been regular allocation rounds
yeah.
that have signaled to the industry there will be an opportunity at this stage.
There's a
There'll be a further
market. Yeah, yeah,
opportunity, and the market can therefore see that. So it's around making sure that that we're signaling to the market that we've got those future opportunities and future allocation rounds, which will help drive in competition, and it will help then bring the cost down and signal to technology innovators, to the supply chain, and to project developers that there will be future opportunities. So all of that will help, but also around making sure that there is this sort of collaborative contracting, so that we're working for these first projects, working with the government to understand the risks and where they're placed, and not pushing the risk down the chain, and of course the higher mitigating high risks cost money, and so that's kind of by having collaborative contracting and sharing some of those risks really helps projects to move forward and to reduce cost as well over time.
You talk about. I don't want to do the carbon markets now. I want to go just to public finance and come back to discuss carbon. GB Energy has been set up by the government, one of the big planks of it. I think it's been a bit wishy-washy. Didn't even know what it was called for a while. The boss of it didn't know whether it's going to be doing anything for 20 years. Now they've got an interim CEO. But I mean, the idea is that the National Wealth Fund will put a stake in to help your members go. I'll take a risk. That means political will. And obviously we know how politics works. We're just seeing it very much so in the US. That can change very quickly. So how are you hoping that you could get public money for the long term? Because you're going to need it, aren't you?
I think so. There are sort of two areas here. So there is the way that the business models are structured at the moment is really based on a contract for difference model. So this is a similar model that's used for offshore wind. It's understood by investors. Importantly, there are bodies, the Low Carbon Contracts Company manages that process. So the whole framework is set up to do that. And that's about, and we can come back to that, but the role of that funding is to essentially top up what the ETS price won't do. So the carbon price in terms of these projects, if you're a cement company, you have to pay for the carbon that you are emitting, but that can be offset against the cost. If you've got carbon capture, you obviously don't have to pay that. But the cost at the moment of carbon capture is higher than the carbon price. So what that subsidy does is fill that gap essentially. And that's for those initial projects. And what we expect to see, and the modelling, is very similar to what's happened with offshore wind. If you look at the size of the first turbines, if you look at the cost of the first project, it has massively come down. And the same with solar, and the same with almost all new technology. I think there are some exceptions, and perhaps these are where they've been stop-start in the market, and you don't have that continuity. So it is, providing that forward plan and being able to do that will reduce those costs. So there's that element in terms of helping to underwrite those initial risks for those first mover projects. The role of GB Energy and National Wealth Fund could be a longer term a stake, I guess, in the infrastructure. And so,
so we would own a bit of it then as the public.
Yes, and I think we're having initial discussions about what the potential could be, but there are opportunities around investing in the supply chain, so investing in the companies that are going to be providing the capture technology, for example. Are there areas where the government could, we've got good innovation in this country, but can we get some of those new innovative technologies scaled up? And that's the difficult part. So could some of that funding be used for that? But also oversizing the infrastructure. So you build the pipeline and you build the store. It makes sense if we know that more industries are going to connect to that infrastructure once it's up and running. And we have already got signs of that. Even in Teesside, with the first investment decisions that have taken place, there is interest now. Industries know that if they locate there, they can connect to those pipes and they can store their CO2, so they can decarbonise. So there is this understanding that, of course, there will be more who want to connect to the network. So it makes sense to build bigger pipes in the first place and to oversize that infrastructure. And that's a role that this type of government funding could potentially play in terms of paying for that upfront oversizing of the infrastructure.
Well, let's explore the one which I skipped, but because I think it's quite difficult for people to understand. Certainly, it's for me. Carbon markets, right? Now, I maybe you were there, but I went to COP in Glasgow, and I really thought they were going to come out with there's a price for carbon. Here it is around the world. The way you trade oil, and off you go. Nothing's happened, right? Nothing's really concretely happened anywhere. If we have a future with CCUS, you'll have all this carbon, right? And obviously there's a value in carbon. You can turn it into other things, etc. But then you'll also have how have I decarbonised by this many tons? Well, I've done better than you, so why am I being penalised? Where do you see carbon capture sitting in kind of carbon trading? I mean, I know it's early days because we're still sort of working out but do you see how it could fit into kind of the way we actually balance the trading of carbon?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because what we do is capture the carbon and store it permanently. So when compared to nature-based solutions for capturing carbon and also removing carbon from the atmosphere, so there's that sort of negative emission. What CCUS provides and those removal technologies is a very credible way of accounting for that carbon, because it's stored permanently, it's monitored, it's measured, and it's not a tree that could be chopped down again, essentially.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So there's a difference there. So there's that credible market. So in terms of where I talked about for some of these industries, we've got industries in the UK that have to pay a carbon price for emitting. So it makes sense for them to avoid paying that, which is what the purpose of that is. It's to send a signal to say you don't want to pay this, you want to decarbonize industry.
Yeah.
What we've got to do is try and make sure that the cost of decarbonisation is matched by what they offset with that price. But then alongside that, there's a very key point around a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if we in the UK are going to have a carbon price that can do that, we have to make sure then that our industries don't become non-competitive. Yes. And so they're not then competing with imports where
the carbon is, exactly,
where the carbon hasn't been captured and therefore is cheaper to manufacture. And so there's a real role for carbon market, but so having a robust emissions trading system in place that also is recognised in the EU. So we've got recognition between the two systems. Having a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so we make sure that our industries don't become less competitive as a result, are really key in terms of driving this market. And the other third point is developing low carbon products. So if you think about the cement that's made that has had the CO2 captured that's low carbon cement or green cement, however we want to label it. How
Same
can
with
we then
steel. Yeah, making steel.
attach a
Yeah, absolutely.
value to
Yeah,
that? Yeah.
yeah,
So that, if you're a company that's building something with that low carbon cement, and that building itself, that company itself has got their own target that they need to reach net zero. And we're finding this with big procurement. If there's big procurement from public bodies and private companies who've committed to net zero, they want to know that they're going to use low carbon cement, low carbon steel, etc. And so how do we provide a value in that? And they're similar to buying uh, appliances that have got, your
yeah.
A grade appliance that are more efficient and use less energy, and there becomes a market for doing that. So those labels were there. So do we create low carbon products with that kind of labeling with a premium? But it then means that actually you've built a new low carbon data center, or whatever it is
The,
that you're building.
the thing about carbon capture is CCS, right? It used to be always called CCS. And it's the U that is very interesting. No one really talks about the U. So you're called, utilization, right? Carbon capture and utilization as well. That's what it's called, yeah? So why are we not doing enough of the U? I think people can understand the carbon capture and you stick it in the ground, fine. But it's a resource, like I just said earlier. And we've done a couple of podcasts where people are like saying, hey, actually, you could take that carbon, you can extract it, you could do things with it. Will there be a value in your industry if you can get the U to mean something?
I think so. I mean, there'll be a value in the industry, and if we can do these low carbon products, and if we create a market for that, there's a value in the industry in selling carbon credits from those removals. So from bioenergy with carbon capture and DAC, as you mentioned, energy from waste plants, all can create those carbon credits. But also there are other forms of utilization, and CO2 can be used in aggregates. It can be created in products like that. I think historically we've focused less in the UK because we've got so much storage. So we have a third of Europe's potential geological storage. So that's been the focus.
Yeah, that's
But
been the
there
thing,
are
yeah.
increasingly now markets here where sustainable aviation fuels, for example, that where there are products that can be made, and therefore there will be a market there. It's just at the moment it's a smaller market, but it will obviously increase in time.
You make a bold claim. You say by 2050, we reckon the industry could create 50,000 jobs and add 94 billion to the economy. Where'd you get those figures from?
This is from looking at all the projects that we've got across the UK. So in the CCSA, we've done something called the delivery plan, where we looked at all the projects that are looking at deploying CCUS. So in 2022, they collectively amounted to 73 million tonnes could be
Right.
captured and stored per year by 2035. That had then increased to 93 million tonnes, I think it was, in a couple of years later. So when we did the update of the report at the end of 2023, it just showed how many new industries there were that were looking to deploy CCUS. There are stores all around the UK that are looking to develop. The NSTA, which is the authority that issues those licenses for offshore storage, has issued over 20 licenses. So there are licenses across potential stores across the UK that could develop and store. So when you think about the number of projects here that are looking to deploy, the number of industries, so it's creating new jobs. There are construction jobs, there are jobs in the supply chain, there are jobs in creating the technology, and then there are operational jobs. It's also protecting jobs in those industries, because without CCUS, those industries have got a choice. Do they carry on emitting, which they can't do by law? Do they close down because they can't afford to pay the carbon price? Or do they go somewhere else where they can access the infrastructure? So, there are those choices there. By putting CCUS in place, we keep those jobs. So if you think of the industrial heartlands we talked about at the beginning, in Humber and Teesside, South Wales, huge amounts of people are employed in
Yeah.
those areas, in
Yeah.
industries, and we can keep them in those jobs. And not only can we keep them, we can then create, we can lead the world in terms of creating these new technologies and these new low carbon products. So it's creating it's also creating jobs and then exporting that to the supply chain. So we know there's I think the number of projects globally increased by 600%, I think, in the last few years.
Yeah.
Huge exponential growth in development of projects. So if the UK
So this is not a fantasy. A bit like fusion is now seeing lots of money. Carbon capture is actually an industry now, in your view.
Definitely. I mean, there are real projects that are storing CO2. There are, those are the over 50 globally in operation.
Yeah.
There are hundreds in development globally. So actually, private sector pouring their own investment into these projects, which is already creating jobs, which is already investing in those. And so if we look to all of those deploying, and it's not only the UK, they're developing projects in Europe, and there are operational projects in Europe. The Middle East has seen huge growth. There are projects in the States. This is Singapore, Malaysia. There are an awful lot of projects in development, China, and Brazil. We've had lots of engagement with all these countries where they're looking to deploy. So the opportunity for the UK, because we're good at the offshore, we understand the offshore.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've had a very good oil and gas industry. If we can capitalize on that and we can export that expertise as well as the supply chain, so all the companies that will be developing the technology and supplying it, there is a huge potential here. So the alternative is that we don't do it. We don't decarbonize our industries. They close down. I always expect doing nothing doesn't maintain the status quo.
No.
Doing nothing means job losses and industry closure, and relying on imports. And I think particularly at the moment, we want to have security of supply of our energy. We want security of supply of our products.
Before we go,
so
two quick things. Teesside, the development there, I think that's going to be a gas plant with carbon capture, right? And most of the things we've talked about in this podcast, it's big stuff, yeah? So there's a furnace, there's a gas plant, there's whatever it is. Two quick points. One, can this be scaled down? So could you have a carbon capture unit stuck onto, I don't know, a factory that's not that big, that's making stuff and can capture its own exhaust fumes? Or is it only for big things like you're talking about, have clusters, have a bunch of companies with pipes, and that's the way it works? How do you see the future in that?
I think that's yet to evolve. I think, these steps we're taking now, it makes sense to have these industries that have to use CCUS. They don't have any other choice. It makes sense for them to share the cost of that infrastructure. So, having this cluster
So it's big stuff right now.
It makes sense. And like you say, power stations are part of that.
Yeah.
And power stations, we refer to it as low carbon dispatchable. But these are, in the modelling that has been done, have how we're going to get to the Clean Power 2030 target, which is one of this new government's targets, as well as net zero. We have to have that low carbon dispatchable power. So we have to have power that we can call upon at very short notice when the sun's not shining, when we don't have enough wind, that will then be there, because we don't want to not have any power. We're not ready for blackouts. We don't want to have that. There's a huge cost to that kind of system. So having this low carbon dispatchable power is essential, and it enables more renewables on the system. So I think that's why we're kind of not saying either or. In time, as the technology evolves,
it gets smaller.
I imagine it could be, for those, we call them dispersed sites, but not necessarily connected to a cluster. Of course, there will be capture. There'll be modular capture technology, and there already is. Lots of companies looking at modular capture technology that we can then just effectively just fit to projects around, and then transport, perhaps by road, transport the CO2 to be stored. And all this is already being looked at. I think we've just got to make sure we get these first projects underway.
Last point, oil and gas, right? You've got a real shake-up going on in the world right now about oil and gas, and you've had firms such as BP saying they're rowing back on their targets. You've got all of that stuff going. Now, my personal view is we're not losing oil and gas anytime soon. So, again, do you think carbon capture could help us clean up oil and gas in a way that, even though people don't like it because we're still getting the stuff out the ground, you're not doing as much damage until we find whatever it is we get, and we get that mix of more renewables, nuclear, etc., to mitigate using fossil fuels altogether. What does your association think about that? Because in my view, that's a good thing. A lot of people say, well, you're continuing the fossil fuel, extraction.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this is back to the discussion we had at the beginning, but this is, we still use fossil fuels for many of these industries, and we need to move away from that, and we mustn't step back from our net zero targets. I think whatever else is going along around the world, we need to keep moving and very much kind of on this transition. We don't have time to wait. So that is essential, and we've got to get there. But we do know that CCUS is essential in getting us there. So if CCUS can be used to decarbonise fossil fuels, which it of course can, then of course that's the route we should go. And this is very much a transition. I don't think this is about saying we can just continue with fossil fuels forever. We've still got to tackle climate change. We've still got to meet net zero. We have to keep those targets in mind, and I think investors and large companies and projects keep those commitments there to enable the industry to move forward. But we can't get away from the fact that we still are incredibly reliant upon fossil fuels, but we've got to transition. So it's a very there's a trajectory here that we've got to follow.
Olivia, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I think it's one of those topics that people should get educated about. I think definitely, because there's a lot of crap out there on the internet, and you can go down warren holes. But I think you've explained it to us very well today. If people go on the website, is there information about what carbon capture is on your website?
There's lots of information on our association.org and maps of where the projects are, and you can then go to those project websites, but also infographics of really what the industry is and what how it works. And which projects are under development. So yes, please do contact us.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.